On July 18, 1940, the Democratic meeting in Chicago overwhelmingly nominated FDR for a third term on the first ballot. We listened on the radio to his acceptance speech, delivered with the confidently intoned upper-class enunciation that for close to 8 years now had inspired millions of ordinary families like ours to remain hopeful in the midst of hardship. There was something about the inherent decorum of the delivery that, alien though it was, not only calmed our anxiety, but bestowed on our family a historical significance, authoritatively merging our lives with his as well as with that of the entire nation when he addressed us in our living room as his fellow citizens. That Americans could choose Lindbergh, that America could choose anybody rather than the two-term president, whose voice alone conveyed mastery over the tumult of human affairs. Well, that was unthinkable, and certainly so for a little American like me, who'd never known a presidential voice other than his. Some 6 weeks later, on the Saturday before Labor Day, Lindbergh surprised the country by failing to appear at the Detroit Labor Day parade, where he had been scheduled to launch his campaign with a motorcade through the working-class heartland of isolationist America, and the anti-Semitic stronghold of Father Coughlin and Henry Ford. And by arriving unannounced, instead, at the Long Island airfield, from which his spectacular transatlantic flight had begun 13 years before, the spirit of St. Louis had been secretly trucked in under a tarp and stored overnight in a remote hangar, though by the time Lindbergh taxied the plane onto the field the next morning, every wire service in America and every radio station and newspaper in New York had a reporter on hand to witness the takeoff. Westward this time, across America to California, rather than eastward across the Atlantic to Europe. Of course, by 1940, commercial air service had been hauling transcontinental freight, passengers, and mail for more than a decade, and doing so largely as a result of the incentive Lindbergh's solo feat and his industrious efforts as $1 million a year consultant to the newly organized airlines. But it wasn't the wealthy advocate of commercial aviation who was launching his campaign that day. Nor was it the Lindbergh who had been decorated in Berlin by the Nazis, nor the Lindbergh who, in a nationwide radio broadcast, had blamed overly influential Jews for attempting to drive the country into war. Nor was it even the stoical father of the infant kidnapped and killed by Bruno Hauptmann in 1932. It was rather the unknown airline pilot who dared to do what had never been done by any aviator before him. The adored Lone Eagle, boyish and unspoiled still, despite the years of phenomenal fame. On the holiday weekend that closed out the summer of 1940, Lindbergh came nowhere near besting the record time for a coast-to-coast non-stop flight that he himself set a decade back with an aircraft more advanced than the old Spirit of St. Louis. Nevertheless, he arrived at Los Angeles Airport, a crowd consisting largely of aircraft workers, tens of thousands of them employed by the big new manufacturers in and around L.A., was as overcome with enthusiasm as any ever to greet him anywhere. The Democrats called the flight a publicity gimmick, stage-managed by Lindbergh's staff, when in fact the decision to fly to California had been made only hours earlier by Lindbergh alone, and not by the professionals who had been assigned by the Republican Party to steer the political novice through his first political campaign, and who, like everyone else, had been expecting him to turn up in Detroit. His speech was unadorned and to the point, delivered in a high-pitched, flat Midwestern, decidedly un-Rooseveltian American voice. His flight outfit of high boots and jodhpurs and a lightweight jumper worn over a shirt and tie was a replica of the one in which he'd crossed the Atlantic, and he spoke without removing his leather headgear or flight goggles, which were pushed up onto his forehead exactly as Sandy had them positioned in the charcoal drawing hidden beneath his bed. "My intention in running for the presidency," he told the raucous crowd, once they had stopped chanting his name, "is to preserve American democracy by preventing America from taking part in another world war. Your choice is simple. It is not between Charles A. Lindbergh and Franklin Delano Roosevelt. It is between Lindbergh and war." That was the whole of it. 41 words, if you included the A for Augustus. After a shower and a snack and an hour's nap there at the L.A. airport, the candidate climbed back into the Spirit of St. Louis and flew to San Francisco. By nightfall, he was in Sacramento, and whether he landed in California that day, it was as though the country hadn't known the stock market crash and the miseries of the Depression or the triumph of FDR for that matter, as though even the war he was there to prevent us from entering hadn't so much as crossed anyone's mind. Lindy flew down out of the sky in his famous plane, and it was 1927 all over again. It was Lindy all over again, straight-talking Lindy, who had never to look or to sound superior, who simply was superior, fearless Lindy at once youthful and gravely mature, the rugged individualist, the legendary American man's man, who gets the impossible done by relying solely on himself. Over the next month and a half, he proceeded to spend one full day in each of the 48 states until, in late October, he made his way back to the Long Island runway from which he'd taken off on Labor Day weekend. Throughout the daylight hours, he would hop from one city, town, or village to the next, landing on highways if there was no nearby airstrip, and setting down and taking off from a stretch of pasture when he flew to talk with farmers and their families in the remotest of America's rural counties. His airfield remarks were broadcast over local and regional radio stations, and several times a week from the state capitol where he was spending the night, he broadcast a message to the nation. It was always succinct and went like this: to prevent war in Europe is now too late. But it is not too late to prevent America from taking part in the war. FDR is misleading the nation. America will be carried to war by a president who falsely promises peace. The choice is simple: vote for Lindbergh or vote for war. As a young pilot in aviation's early novelty days, Lindbergh alone, with an older, more experienced sidekick, had entertained crowds throughout the Midwest by skydiving in a parachute or walking out parachuteless onto the plane's wing, and the Democrats were now quick to belittle his barnstorming in the Spirit of St. Louis by likening it to these stunts. At press conferences, Roosevelt no longer bothered to make a derisive clip when questioned by newsmen about the unorthodox Lindbergh campaign, but simply moved on to discuss Churchill's fear of an imminent German invasion of Britain, or to announce that he would be asking Congress to fund the first American peacetime draft, or to remind Hitler that the United States would not tolerate any interference with the transatlantic aid our merchant vessels were supplying to the British war effort. It was clear from the start that the president's campaign was to consist of remaining in the White House, where, in contrast to what Secretary Ix labeled Lindbergh's carnival antics, he planned to address the hazards of the international situation with all the authority at his command, working round the clock if necessary. Twice during the state-by-state tour, Lindbergh was lost in bad weather, and each time several hours passed before radio contact with him was re-established, and he was able to let the country know that all was well. But then in October, on the very day, Americans were stunned to learn that in the latest of the destructive night raids on London, the Germans had bombed St. Paul's Cathedral. A news flash at dinner time reported that the Spirit of St. Louis had been seen to explode in the air over the Alleghenies and plummet to the earth in flames. This time it was 6 long hours before a second flash corrected the first, with the news that it was engine trouble and not a mid-air explosion that had forced Lindbergh to make an emergency landing on treacherous terrain in the mountains of western Pennsylvania. Before the emendation was aired, however, our phone rang continuously, friends and relatives calling to speculate whether our parents, on the initial account of the fiery and probably fatal accident in front of Sandy and me, our parents said nothing to indicate relief at the prospect of Lindbergh's death, though neither did they say they hoped it wasn't so, nor were they among the jubilant when around 11 that night word came through that, far from having gone down in flames, the Lone Eagle had emerged safely from the undamaged plane and was waiting only for a replacement part so as to take off and resume his campaign. And we will pause there.